Welcome to the Allison Knows podcast. So, today we're going to try to understand something pretty complex. The economic journey of Black Americans in America. You know, I love a good deep dive. And we've got some sources that point to like this really interesting pattern. It seems like every time there's progress for Black communities, there's like this push to like reverse it.
Yeah, it's almost like a historical tug of war. You see all this advancement and then bam, people try to just erase it all.
Right. So it's not just like random events. It's like a pattern. And people are calling these moments of progress reconstructions,
Yeah.
like rebuilding, and then the backlash after. And one of our main sources is a transcript from the Roland Martin show where they really dig into this idea of a third reconstruction.
Yeah, and what's fascinating is how each reconstruction kind of builds on the one before it. But they all have these unique challenges. It's wild.
Okay, so let's rewind way back.
Hmm.
Reconstruction 1.0 after the Civil War, 1865 to 1877. Now, this is when we see the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th. Abolishing slavery, granting citizenship, and giving Black men the right to vote.
Those were huge GE, yeah. But you know what sometimes gets overlooked? The Civil Rights Act of 1866. That one went beyond just citizenship. It gave Black Americans the right to make and enforce contracts. That was huge for economic participation.
Well, that's a good point. It's like the foundation for being able to actually participate in the economy.
Exactly. And we see the results, right? Black businesses started popping up all over the place. Black folks getting elected to office. There was even a Black majority legislature in South Carolina.
That's amazing. I read that some historians see that time as like a little preview of what a real multiracial democracy could be like. But of course, the sources also talk about how there was this resistance to all this progress.
Oh, yeah, there was a lot of resentment brewing. The sources actually quote this one guy from back then who said, these white folks were like, no, we have done enough for these Black people. And that really fueled the whole Compromise of 1877.
Compromise of 1877, yeah. That feels like the first big example of this backlash we're talking about.
It really is. Because what happened? Federal troops were pulled out of the South. Reconstruction was basically abandoned. And that's when the Jim Crow era started up. With all that disenfranchisement of Black voters and everything.
And Jim Crow was about more than just segregation, right?
Right.
It was also about keeping Black Americans from gaining economic power.
Absolutely. Access to good education, forget about it. Well-paying jobs, nope. And you know what? We still see the effects of that today.
It's crazy how long that impact lasts. So then we fast forward to the mid-20th century, and bam, Reconstruction 2.0 with the Civil Rights Movement. Think about the big names from that time. Emmett Till, Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr. They were so courageous. Their actions really forced America to face its problems.
And this time it wasn't just about legal rights. People were starting to understand that the economic gap was a huge problem. There were all these systemic barriers holding Black Americans back.
And there's this one guy, Arthur Fletcher, who is a big part of this movement, but doesn't always get the recognition he deserves.
Oh, yeah. Arthur Fletcher, he was brilliant. He knew that just ending segregation wasn't enough. He pushed for affirmative action programs to create real economic opportunities.
Affirmative action, that's a big one. But even with all this progress, the same pattern emerges, right? There was pushback against the civil rights movement every step of the way.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Remember Barry Goldwater? He was super vocal against the Civil Rights Act of 1964. He said it was government overreach. That was a sign of this growing conservative movement that basically didn't want the government to do anything about racial inequality.
It's almost like every attempt to make things fair is seen as taking something away from someone else.
Yeah, and that resistance often tries to weaken those policies that are meant to help. Like later on, Ronald Reagan, he really tried to dismantle affirmative action. He said it wasn't needed anymore.
So it's like one step forward, two steps back. Every time there's progress, there's a reaction to try and undo it.
Exactly. And if we understand this pattern, it helps us understand what's happening today.
So now we get to what some people are calling Reconstruction 3.0, the time after George Floyd was murdered in 2020. What's different about this time compared to the other reconstructions?
I think what's really different now is the focus on economic justice. Like, it's not just about changing laws or saying the right things. It's about closing the racial wealth gap and getting rid of the systems that keep Black Americans from being economically equal.
And this is where the pushback gets even stronger, right?
Right.
The sources we're looking at say there's a real effort to defund Black America.
Defund Black America. That's a powerful phrase. And it really describes what's happening. Look at the attacks on critical race theory, all this stuff about wokeness. It's all designed to make people not care about racial justice anymore.
It's like they're trying to make it seem like it's wrong to even talk about race and equality.
Yeah, and it's not just talk. They're actually trying to get rid of DEI programs in companies and schools. There are even stories about Black people getting scholarships and job offers and then having them taken away.
It's crazy. It's like there's a plan to undo all the progress that's been made.
It's definitely a strategy to keep things the way they are, to keep the same people in power.
So what are they actually doing to defund Black America? What do the sources say?
Well, one of the biggest things is this new attack on voting rights. They're passing all these laws to make it harder for people to vote, especially in Black communities.
It's like they want to go back to the time before the Voting Rights Act.
And they're also trying to weaken the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the one that made discrimination illegal. It's like they're trying to erase history.
It's mind-boggling. Why attack the very things that made progress possible?
I think it shows just how much resistance there is to real racial equality. They want to keep their privilege, even if it means other people suffer.
Before we continue with this deep dive, I want to remind you to like, subscribe, and share Allison Knows on Spotify and YouTube. It really helps me create more content like this.
We appreciate your support. Yeah, it makes you think, like, what can we even do about it?
Yeah.
The sources talk about some solutions, though.
What kind of solutions?
One of the biggest is economic action. The sources really push the idea of supporting Black-owned businesses.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Like being mindful of where we spend our money can actually make a difference.
Totally. It's like investing directly in Black communities, helping them build wealth from the ground up. And the Black consumer market is huge GE.
Huge GE. I think I read somewhere that Black buying power in the U.S. could be like almost $2 trillion by next year. That's serious economic power.
And the sources even talk about maybe boycotting companies that do things that hurt Black communities, hit them where it hurts the most.
Yeah, like their profits. Send a message that we won't support companies that are part of the problem.
Exactly. But economic action alone isn't enough. We got to do more.
Like what? What else do the sources say?
Well, they talk a lot about getting involved politically, especially with all these attacks on voting rights happening right now. They say voting is more important than ever.
Yeah, it's scary to see how they're trying to make it harder for people to vote, especially in Black communities. It's like they're trying to undo all the progress that's been made.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to understand the history of voter suppression, because what's happening now isn't new. It's just a continuation of what's been going on for centuries.
It's not just about voting in one election. It's about protecting our democracy, making sure everyone has a voice.
Absolutely. We have to be informed and engaged, and we have to speak up about the things that are important to us. And you know what else? The sources talk about how important it is to support Black media.
Black media?
Yeah, like independent Black-owned media outlets. They're doing some really important work. They're telling the stories that the mainstream media often ignores.
Yeah, it's like they're giving a voice to the people who are often silenced. They're providing a different perspective, one that we need to hear.
And they're holding people in power accountable. They're not afraid to speak truth to power. But they need our support. By reading their articles, watching their videos, subscribing to their channels. The sources specifically mention the Black Star Network. It's a great example of an independent media company that's dedicated to telling the truth from a Black perspective.
Yeah, it's so important to get our news and information from lots of different sources, not just the mainstream ones.
That's how we learn to think critically and form our own opinions. It's like when you look at a painting from different angles, you see different things. Same with information.
I like that analogy. So it sounds like economic empowerment, political engagement, media representation, they're all connected.
Exactly. You can't really have one without the others. And that's what makes this idea of a third Reconstruction so important. It recognizes that real equality requires us to change things on multiple levels.
It's not enough to just change laws.
Right.
We have to change the way power works in our society.
And that's going to require all of us to step up, to use our voices, our resources, our influence to push for change.
One of the things that really stood out to me from these sources is that we're not powerless. Like, we actually have the ability to make things better.
Right. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by all the bad stuff happening, but we got to remember that things can change. We've seen it happen before, and we can make it happen again.
It gives me hope to hear that.
Me too. And one small thing you can do right now to help is to subscribe and share Allison Knows on Spotify and YouTube. It really helps us get the word out and keep having these important conversations.
That's right. Thanks for reminding me.
Every little bit helps. It's
Yeah.
true, it can feel like a lot sometimes, but it's important to remember that we can make a difference when we work together.
It's about more than just feeling good,
Yeah.
right? Like, as we've been going through these sources, I've been thinking this time, this moment, it's tough, but it's also a chance for real change.
Yeah, there's definitely something special about this moment. People are more aware of racial injustice now. There's more activism and more people are willing to talk about systemic racism, even if it's uncomfortable.
Yeah, it feels like people are waking up. They're starting to see how the past is connected to what's happening now.
Exactly. And that's so important for making real change happen. More and more people are realizing that racial equity isn't just some feel-good thing. It's good for everyone. It's good for the economy, too.
You mentioned earlier this idea of economic self-sufficiency for Black communities.
Yeah.
Can we talk more about that? What does that actually look like?
Well, the sources talk about a few things. One of the big ones is supporting Black-owned banks and financial institutions.
Right, because access to money is like the key to building wealth,
Hmm.
starting businesses, investing in communities.
Exactly. And historically, Black-owned businesses have had a really hard time getting loans and investments.
Yeah, I remember reading about redlining, where banks would basically refuse to give loans to people in Black neighborhoods.
Yeah, redlining, it was just straight up discrimination.
Yeah.
And it had a huge impact on Black communities. It prevented people from buying homes and building wealth that they could pass on to their kids.
So supporting Black-owned banks is like a way to fight back against that?
Exactly. It's about creating new ways for Black communities to become economically powerful, building institutions that actually care about them.
The sources also mention this idea of like defunding certain corporations, the ones that have a history of exploiting Black workers or doing things that hurt Black communities.
Yeah, that one's a little more controversial. But the idea is that we can use our money to hold those corporations accountable.
Yeah, I've seen campaigns against companies that make money from private prisons or companies that pollute in Black neighborhoods.
It's a way to use our economic power to try and change how corporations behave.
But I guess there are different opinions on whether boycotts actually work or not.
Yeah, some people say they're hard to keep going and they might have some unintended consequences.
But the main point is that the choices we make about where we spend our money actually matter. We can either support systems that are unfair, or we can help build a more just world.
Absolutely. Our choices have power. And I think
Yeah.
that's a really important thing to take away from this conversation.
It brings us back to this whole third Reconstruction idea. It's not about waiting for the government to fix things. It's about taking action ourselves in our own lives and in our communities.
It's about building a movement for change from the ground up.
So what can people listening do to get involved? What are some practical things they can do?
Well, we talked about supporting Black-owned businesses and banks. There are websites and directories that can help you find those businesses in your area.
Oh, that's helpful. What about getting involved in politics?
Yeah.
Besides voting, what else can people do?
Talk to your elected officials. Call them people. Email them. Let them know that you care about things like voting rights, criminal justice reform, and economic equity.
And support organizations that are working to make things better.
Yeah, absolutely. There are so many amazing organizations out there doing important work to fight for racial justice, to empower Black communities, and to change the systems that are causing these problems.
It's also important to educate ourselves and stay informed.
Yes. Read books, listen to podcasts, talk to people who have different perspectives. It's all about learning and growing.
We have to understand the history, the current problems, and the possible solutions.
And we have to be willing to look at our own biases and have those tough conversations, even when they're uncomfortable.
This whole conversation has been so eye-opening for me. I feel like I understand so much more now about the history, the patterns, and the things that keep pushing us back.
Me too. It's a good reminder that the fight for racial justice is far from over. We all need to be involved and informed if we want to see real change.
So even though there are a lot of challenges right now, I want our listeners to leave with a sense of hope.
Yes, there's so much potential for good things to happen. We're seeing more activism, more people committed to social justice, and a growing understanding that we need real change.
We can make the world a more just and fair place.
And every single one of us can be part of that. Whether it's supporting Black-owned businesses, getting involved in politics, or learning more and talking to others, our actions matter.
That's a great message to end on. Thank you so much for being here and sharing your insights with us. This has been a really valuable conversation.
It's been my pleasure. And before we go, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share Allison Knows on Spotify and YouTube. It helps us reach more people and keep these conversations going.
That's right. Thanks for reminding everyone. And thank you all for listening to the Allison Knows podcast. Follow Allison on Blue Sky, YouTube, and TikTok.